Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second annual St. Lawrence Leadership Day. It's wonderful to see you all this morning. Our theme, sort of a varied theme, but one of our themes for this morning is the idea of the speed of change. So as I was preparing for this, I don't know, some of you probably have a similar device to this. Something that keeps us in touch whether we want to be or not. And I think back to 50 years ago, what this does couldn't even fit in a room before, which is absolutely amazing to think about. IBM had these huge rooms with these huge computers, and they would do things like calculate pi, And we have these things, that would play music, and, I could talk to anybody anywhere in the whole world. It's just amazing. So I thought about the kinds of changes that we've seen over the past 50 years or so. We went from the idea of the Cold War and this distant enemy with ICBM missiles pointed at each other, to really having this clear and present anxiety about terrorism in a way that we didn't used to feel. We also went from the American normal being Ozzie and Harriet, the white family, 2 kids, suburban, and really we are moving into a multicultural world. And that's really different. It's something that we really have to adjust to going forward. We've gone from an expectation of there always being a sizable middle class and that being the anchor of our country, and now we're going into a period of financial not knowing, which is really, really uncomfortable. We also went from a place of really not hardly even paying attention to the environment. This is about the time Silent Spring was being written, to having some really dire concerns about climate change and things happening that may not even be reversible. And at the same time, the church has changed. The church used to be the center of people's lives, or at least an important part of people's lives. Ministers had authority, but since then, because of the religious right and having religion defined in a certain way that some people can't get beyond, because of the abuses of the priests in the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy covering it up, the Catholic Church has lost their moral authority. And also, there just seems to be a shrinking of our social contract of holding up the ideal of love thy neighbor, or caring for one another, being replaced with this Ayn Rand kind of every person for themselves, and seeing tension in our culture around those two ideals. And of course, what we're hearing is all of these unchurched people who really aren't that interested in going to church because they have an idea of what church is like, and they don't want any part of it. But we do hear that people want to feel like they're spiritual. They just don't want any of that religion stuff to muddy up their spirituality. So I want to make this a little bit of an interactive keynote this morning. So I'd like to ask you to think about what are some of the challenges that you're facing now in your own congregations and the communities in which your congregations are located, the kinds of changes that weren't even imaginable 50 years ago. So I invite you to turn to the person next to you, or if there's a couple people, and just chat for a few minutes, about 2 or 3 minutes, think about those changes and what they look like and maybe what they feel like a little bit. So when I was discussing the idea of this keynote, I said, the one thing I really love about upstate Western New York is that whole idea of everything that happened in the early 19th century. It was called the Burnt Over District and stuff. And I was a history major in one of my previous lives. And this was the time period that I studied. And this area was the area that held the most interest for me. And I'm thinking about how the ingenuity that happened in this area can be a model for us moving forward. So I want to share a little bit about, many of you probably got this history in school around here, but a lot of it involves religion, so I'm not sure that all of the details were shared with you, because sometimes schools don't tell the whole story, they just tell the political stuff and the economic stuff. So as most of you know, 1825, the Erie Canal was completed. And in that period from 1800 to 1850, the population exploded in this part of New York. From 1820 to 1830, Albany and Utica doubled in population over the course of 10 years. Syracuse and Buffalo tripled, and Rochester increased fivefold. So as you think about, we have some contraction changes, but they had these expansion changes they were dealing with. And of course, this was the frontier then, right? So you had all these young men drinking heavily, spitting tobacco in the streets. Livestock were wandering around the streets of the city, so you had to watch where you stepped. There was a real, the social order wasn't really established yet. People tended to sit down in the taverns and restaurants and shovel food in their mouths with no conversation. And there was just a general lack of privacy about people's business, especially newcomers. People, felt like they, as people moved in, there was this sense of having a right to know their business. So eventually things settled down a little bit. Communities formed. And a lot of the people who came here were from New England. And a lot of them were Unitarians and Universalists who settled in this area from New England. But they had this moral sense, the way New Englanders do, sort of that Puritan ethic, this idea of creating a godly community. And they had that sense about them. But they were also a little bit more optimistic than their relatives back home. One of the things that I think is really interesting is there were always rumors of buried treasure around, like, the Native Americans, had all this gold that they had squirreled away, and that, the lucky settler would find that gold. They were also very educated. Almost everyone was able to read the Bible, if nothing else, from a very young age. There was also this sense of mission in this area because of the frontier aspect. The Presbyterians and the Congregationalists came together and combined their resources, mostly Presbyterian, but to spread the idea of religion. So they would have pamphlets and distribute free Bibles and things like that. And during this period, those two denominations worked together. Of course, they're spreading that Calvinistic kind of Christianity, but they were really key in getting some of these religious ideas out. They were also really well informed. There were lots of local papers, and people sort of knew what was going on and talked to one another. So there was a social sense of paying attention to what was happening. Now, at the same time, women had a little bit more leisure time. I think this is always really important, that they used to have to make homespun, right? They'd have to take wool and spin it into cloth and then weave it and then make clothes out of it. But this area was really heavy in the textile industry, so women were able to just buy cloth, whole cloth, and this freed up tons of time, so they had a lot more time to do things like work on the mission work and things like that. The other thing is that there was this definite, and I know you probably don't see any of this today, but this independent streak, independent thinking, not really listening, to what the common wisdom is, to really figure it out and decide for yourself. So this is part of what was happening in this area during this time period. So whenever there's a lot of change that people are dealing with and coming to a new normal, if you will, we tend to respond in different ways. Now, one of the main things that happened in this area is this Anti-Mason movement. The Masons were huge back in the early 19th century. And the Masons, of course, are a secret society, kind of, sort of this Christian element, but there's all this other weird stuff that you're not really sure about. And some of it looks maybe even like devil worship. You're not really sure, but it was all very secret, so something bad must be going on, right? And the other aspect about the Masons is that it really included people from the upper class. And there were a lot of clergy who were Masons. In fact, they say that a quarter of the clergy of the mainline denominations were part of the Masonic order, which is pretty big when you think about it. People in the pews, it was about 20%. So a good part of the ministers were a part of these secret societies. Now, about this time, there was a man, I don't remember his name, but he was going to publish a tell-all book about all of the secrets of the Masons. And he disappeared, and they never found his body. So this event precipitated this huge anti-Mason backlash. And people just came out in droves, and it was a cause that everyone could get behind. And it really sort of whipped up this emotional enthusiasm that ended up then, that enthusiasm sort of infected all these later movements that came through the area. The other thing that was happening around this time is there were revivals going on. A gentleman named Charles Finney, who was a Presbyterian, did these tent revivals, and he was this amazing speaker, and he'd get these people all riled up, and they were New Light conversions, so they had that moment of conversion. Unitarians and Universalists sort of believed, you sort of slowly grow and develop, but you go to one of these tent meetings and you give your life over to Jesus, and so the churches started, or at least the revivalists started converting all these people who would actually end up getting converted over and over again as the new revivals came through. But there was this, and it was fun to go to, and it was interesting, and that's where the term burned over district came from, is that so many revivals came through here, pretty much everybody who was convertible was converted. So there was no fuel left for the fire, if you will. So that's where the burned over name came from. So what happened with all these itinerant preachers coming through is people started ignoring their local pastors a little more. The idea of, again, they want to think for themselves, and they're reading these pamphlets with these new ideas, and suddenly they're not so sure they want to believe what's coming out of their local pulpit anymore. And the lay leadership, and along with the some of these clergy were Masons, so there was a little bit of backlash against that aspect of the clergy's authority. So lay leadership actually became more powerful in this area. And again, I think you still see the effects of that in the upstate and western New York. So the other thing that's going on at this time, the people who were members of churches, of congregations, saw all these people that were suddenly, energized by Christianity, and they were pretty much supporting, their business owners, shopkeepers, mill owners, things like that. They're thinking, well, if we bring these people into our churches, they'll help support us, they'll give money to the church, and I wouldn't have to put as much money or time into it. Does this sound a little familiar? And so they tended to take on some of these revival techniques and ideas. Not so much that they believed them, but they saw them as a way to grow their membership. So this was going on. So imagine yourself here, and all these people are converting to Christianity. Boy, that feels like the end times is coming, doesn't it? And there was this momentum of other movements that happened at the same time. One was the temperance movement. Drunkenness, of course, was, those drunks weren't coming to the tent meetings. If we eliminate alcohol, we can convert even more people. And also passing blue laws where you can't conduct business on Sundays was another way of encouraging more conversions. And of course, the mission work, more Bibles, more pamphlets. I read something about how everybody had Bibles, but in order to raise more money back east, they sort of fudged the numbers so that they could get more money to distribute more Bibles. But there were plenty of Bibles in this area. Almost everybody had them, but it was still one of these selling points for the mission, the people raising money for the missions. Now, the thing that I find really, really fascinating about this period during this time are all of the new religious movements that started here. Most of you are probably familiar with Joseph Smith, the person who started the Church of Latter-day Saints. Now, of course, there's these stories about buried treasure floating around, and the fact that he found these gold plates underneath a hill sort of fit in with that whole idea, and people were, primed to believe that story. And of course, he started the Church of Latter-day Saints, and they moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where I was just a couple nights ago. We have a Unitarian Universalist church there, and then further west. The other thing that was going on was this idea, and I think this is really fascinating because we've just seen this, the people who believe the end time is coming and they have a date. So there was a group called the Millerites that did this. And again, they, sort of what we saw this past year with, I think, May 21st it was supposed to end, and now it's going to be October, so. But there was that kind of movement going on. And also the Adventists also had a similar kind of, the end times are just upon us. And then there were another group, such as the Oneida community and the Shakers, sort of on opposite ends of the sexual spectrum, but the Shakers being celibate and the Oneida community practicing, they didn't call it free love, they called it open love or something. Anyway, this idea of creating a closed community that strives to create the kingdom of God on earth. So we had those experiments going on around here. And then we had spiritualism. And this was sort of the science was sort of coming into its own, modern science during this period. And the idea of using scientific method to speak to the great beyond had a lot of appeal. And the Universalists actually were very, very entwined with the spiritualist movement. They saw it as something rational. We may not look at it that way today, but they saw this as a way of using science to approach what they still believed as an afterlife. So this was going on in this area as well. Although it started out east, it did catch fire in this part of the world. Now, as all this stuff was going on, the Unitarians and the Universalists and the Episcopalians were pretty much just plodding along as they always have. Rational, holding their traditions, except for the Universalists and the spiritualist movement. Pretty much everything was I don't want to say stayed the same, but they weren't caught up in all of this emotional upheaval that was happening in this area. One thing that I find also really interesting is that the Universalists were held up often by these evangelicals as part of the problem of the West. They didn't believe in hell, so they had to be immoral. And actually, Universalists and Unitarians were not allowed, for the most part, to use public buildings like the town hall or schools for their worship services, the way the other denominations were. So we had that kind of struggle here, even back then, of being on the outside. And also, Universalists were quite often kept from serving on juries, again, because they felt that since we didn't believe in hell, we didn't have a moral center. So anyway, I find this sort of interesting that this is an area of experimentation, and I hope that you hold that spirit as you think about what your congregations can do moving forward. Feel that freedom of, maybe not discovering gold plates buried in a hill, although that would be handy, but the idea of looking at the change that you're facing as an opportunity to respond really creatively. So I want to fast forward back to 2011, and I want you to spend a little time thinking of some of the crazy responses. I've mentioned a couple of them. Some of the strange responses that our society is having to what we're facing now, change-wise. So, going forward, most of one of my interests these days is adaptive leadership, and I'm doing a little workshop on it after the keynote today. And in adaptive leadership, they talk about two different kinds of challenges. There's challenges that require a technical solution, and there's challenges that require a solution where we need to adapt. We need to change our own behavior, and not just change our own behavior, but also figure out what the questions are. We can't quite understand what's going on. Global climate change is one of those things, I think, that we see something happening. There's responses that are technical fixes, like driving a hybrid, which I do. That's a technical fix. We know, everybody driving hybrids is not going to take care of the problem. So that's a way that we can respond, which is technical. The idea is that we invite people into a conversation where we discern together what's going on. How might we live in the world in a way that would enable our children's children's children to have a healthy world in which to live. What would that look like? How would us living in the world differently approach that? So that's an adaptive way, and really together coming up with a solution. So, and what happens is people tend to try to put technical fixes on these adaptive challenges, or they do what they call work avoidance, where they do something that, one example is, well, there's the denial, of course, and we see a lot of things up there about denial. But the whole thing with the Tea Party has brought up some issues that they say are issues, and that's their work avoidance of really dealing with the debt, let's say. The debt, part of the work avoidance is really they're going to have to talk about the holistic what's going on in government, and what they're doing is pointing at little bits and pieces, whether raise taxes, lower spending. Those are technical solutions, so really they need to stand back and really look at how we do government in general. That's more of an adaptive response to that particular problem that we're facing. That's a real brief overview of that. So going forward, what I'm inviting you into is thinking about what are the adaptive challenges we're facing. We know that people aren't coming to churches the way they used to. Maybe even we have to rethink the way we do church, the way we approach our congregations. We really have to step back and ask some bigger questions about what 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, faith communities might look like. So it's important that we always connect to our faithful core. It's not just about, filling our pews with members who write us checks every year. It's more about, who are we as Unitarian Universalists, and first of all, how do we stay true to that faithful core that we hold together? It's important that we know what that core is. I'm working with a congregation right now, and they're working with sort of this nebulous sort of core. They sort of think they know what it is, but if you really talk to people, they don't necessarily have the same ideas. They're not going to be able to move forward until they have a shared understanding of what they are and who they are in their community. It's also important to stand back and get up on the balcony and reassess our congregations. What's working? What's not working? What might we have to unbuild before we can rebuild for the future? Those of you who attended the Big Dogs Conference, that we had a little conference last spring that Mark Bernstein ran about for our churches that are sort of in between mid-size and large congregations. And part of any transition is letting go of something, learning how to do that, learning how to lead that kind of change. The other thing is to understand what our unique message is in the world. And we don't have to necessarily have a unique message as Unitarian Universalists, but what about your congregation? Most of you have been paying attention to what's been going up in Rochester with their Listen, Open, Serve that permeates everything they do. They had that lovely homecoming video that went viral on the internet. If you haven't had a chance to see it, just go to their Rochester website. The link's right on the homepage. Unitarian. I'm sorry, yes, First Unitarian of Rochester, because there is a Universalist church in Rochester. Thank you. I haven't met them yet, so as soon as I do, I can. But understanding what the unique message is. The other thing is really helping our congregations to become learning communities. We have to admit to ourselves that we used to have the answers, but we don't have the answers anymore. So how do we shift our own self-understanding from being the educated, brilliant, smart people, which we still are, but we're facing new challenges. So how can we develop the humility as a community to engage with being a learning community, with trying things and maybe making a mistake along the way? These are all things that we need our congregations to do. And the other thing that we're preaching, at least as district and regional staff, is to get together with one another, the other congregations in your district. And with today's technology, you can connect with congregations across the country. But you learn from one another way more than you'll ever learn from any of us. And so find ways to connect with one another. We're trying to provide cluster opportunities. I know that the CRUNY cluster has opportunities to come together. But look for ways to learn and connect with one another. So I want you to, in the spirit of the burnt over time period, think of this heritage that you have of creative responses to the crazy changes that we're seeing these days. And I'd like you to spend a few moments again chatting with the people next to you. If you want to shift and talk to some new people, that would be fine too. But just think about maybe share some of the creative responses that you might be doing or considering in your own congregation right now as you face some of these challenges. And we'll go a little bit deeper into this toward the end of the hour, but I wanted just to hear a little bit about what you're doing right now before we move forward. So I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes. So I'd like to hear some of the creative things that are going on here in the St. Lawrence district. Anybody want to share some of the things that are going on in their congregation or the congregation of the person they were talking to yesterday?
Small group ministry we've been doing for 10 or more years now, and it has just transformed the culture of our congregation for the good.
Small groups, wonderful, yes.
I think we champion the notion of pastoral care, that it doesn't have to come from a minister, that it can come from a congregation.
Yes.
We've added a Saturday service.
Saturday service. Hear the buzz with that one? Can you do that? Yes.
We really opened ourselves up to understand that we have to have a digital welcome table. So we have a Twitter account. We're active on Facebook. We're active within Facebook in the denomination, in growth labs and worship labs and evangelism labs. And so it's both better outreach and better connection.
There's a challenge among I think it's on the Growth Lab, for everybody to really look at their website and to, make sure it looks good when you look it up on one of these. Maybe those QR codes, those goofy little square codes that bring you to the website or some frequently asked questions. So yeah, absolutely. I saw you over there, yes.
Because of the major concerns about global warming, climate change, and the hydrofracking, other environmental issues, Green Sanctuary is hosting Environment Month here at Memorial for October. All of October is Environment Month. Green Sanctuary Month.
Wonderful. So pulling up the awareness about the issues around climate change and other issues in a way in your community, not just in your congregation. Wonderful. Wonderful. A couple more over there.
We have organized a greeting program for the front door of the church on Sunday with procedures and follow-up.
And part-time staff.
So seeing the importance of welcoming newcomers as being important enough to have a paid position to do. One more? Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. So, as I think about this idea of reassessing and rebuilding, or rebuilding and unbuilding and then rebuilding, I've been, those of you who have taken any of my leadership development webinars, I'm working on a class, sort of an online class, I think it's going to be a 4-week class. And I've been trying to think of this overview of how leadership development fits into what I call not the path of membership, but the journey of membership in our congregations. Leadership development being a possibility in that journey. So I'm imagining from when someone first hears about Unitarian Universalism and what it looks like from there. So usually people go to the website, and they usually end up on the UUA website. I found that almost everybody who walks through our doors has been to the UUA website and probably our congregation's website. So when they tool around on the UUA website, I went on there as if I were a newcomer. And they see things like spiritual practice, inspiration and guidance, many paths. This all sounds kind of familiar, right? So these are things that we hold up on the UU website as what we are promising in our congregations. But when they walk through our doors, quite often what they'll encounter is we sort of assume that church is important, and if you walk through the doors, you agree with that. Not everybody who walks through our doors is quite there yet. We have these institutions that some of them have been there for over 100 years that we might be inviting people into, structures, committees, positions. As we do leadership development, we think of committees and positions. We think of slots to be filled. And there's also this, in congregations, we're friendly, we have tight communities, but also it can sometimes feel like there are insiders and outsiders to newcomers. So how do we, as a community, be radically welcoming to newcomers as they come in? And my colleague Mark talks a lot about this idea of hospitality and welcoming of people. So we promise this idea of formation and inspiration and guidance on our websites, but we don't always really deliver that, or if we do, you have to sort of dig through stuff to find it. So I'm wondering what our congregations might look like if we put out front how we can do that for them. How can we do that for people who come to our doors? Help them find meaning and purpose. Help them find deep connections with others and with things that they care about. That idea of transformation, transformational worship services, programming that just isn't about learning about Buddhism, but really finding their own spiritual core. What would that look like? And this idea of unbuilding, I think, is helpful. There's a church consultant named Thomas Bandy, which I've been reading his books like crazy. He's really speaking to me. But in one of his books, he had this metaphor of the church roof. And in the pre-modern times, when there was a problem with the church roof, anybody have church roof problems? I saw there's a bucket. There's a bucket in the room where my workshop's going to be. So back in pre-modern times, what they did is they replaced the thatch with slate and then put some gargoyles around for good measure, right? And then about 50 years ago, what they would do is have maybe a little capital campaign and get the lowest bid possible and then replace the roof. And Bandy says, do we even need a roof?
We don't.
And we do. We have young adults who have church communities, have communities of faith that aren't necessarily housed in buildings. Not that I'm saying we should necessarily get rid of our beloved church buildings, but to really think, what's our core purpose? And are we is our building serving that purpose? Is our building drawing off resources that are better spent on our core purpose? So these are radical questions, but think about that roof metaphor. I love the gargoyle imagery, actually. But really today, what does, with the internet and things, are there different ways of being church communities, or different ways of connecting with one another? And the other thing I want us to bring us back to is this whole idea of what is our unique message. And I think there's some commonalities. And looking at the UUA website, there's certainly themes that most of us resonate with. But there's that notion of radical love. This comes out of both our Universalist tradition, with the idea that there's that God loves us all so much that there would be no hell, but also out of our Unitarian tradition, and the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came together to seek the truth in love, this idea of a community based on love of one another. We also have a unique message, I think, that diversity is foundational to our the way we govern, the way we make decisions. The whole idea of congregational polity is we believe that the wisdom doesn't come from a bishop, it comes from the wisdom of the gathered faithful. And the more diverse that gathered faithful is, the closer we come to the truth. So, or what the answer is, if you will. The truth with a capital T, maybe, is not necessarily a postmodern concept, but this idea of the more voices you have, the more different ways of looking at a problem, the more likely you're going to be closer to what the solution is. The other part that I think is really unique about Unitarian Universalism is that idea of human potential. This is a core part of our humanist heritage, that we believe that each and every one of us has potential, and how do we develop that? And how do we communicate that to people who walk through our doors, that we think that they are, we know that they are a gift, and we want to help them to bloom. So how do we invite people into that? And we also have this unique message of the here and now. Not some future world, not some afterlife, but how can we make today the best day? How can we be in the now with our full attention, our full being? So I want you to take a couple more minutes and think about what is the unique purpose of your congregation that you are inviting people into as they walk through the doors. I do want to share, before we break, some sources of hope that I have for our congregations. One is this idea of the energy that's happening around forming clusters and helping one another through our cluster relationships. I think that Dave talked about healthy congregations. This bringing healthy congregations into the St. Lawrence district, I think, is going to be really, really helpful for you. And I encourage you to take that training when you can. There's one happening in Binghamton, I think the weekend after next, 2 weeks from today, I think, or 2 weeks from yesterday. And then we're also looking to train people to help you lead Harvest the Power, which is leadership training. And I know Jeff is going to be attending that training of trainers, so we'll schedule things around that. I also am excited about the idea of the Commission Lay Leader program, helping the lay leaders be stronger and better and more grounded in Unitarian Universalism. I'm excited that people are looking to create intergenerational communities in their congregations. This is fabulous. I also am really excited about the Gathered Here initiative. At first I thought this was one of those dopey UUA programs. Not that we ever have any of those. But I got the chance to participate, not as a questioner, but as someone who is being asked these really deep questions about what's my core as a Unitarian Universalist, and what do I see our Unitarian, what's valuable and what's the important aspect of Unitarian Universalism for me and for our communities. And I really invite you to participate. I know they're looking for people to do these kinds of interviews and to have congregational conversations, but even if, and Joan Van Beesler has information about that, if you want to grab her, I really recommend that. But also to participate. Just the chance to reflect in a deep way with another UU is a really wonderful experience. And the other thing that I'm really kind of excited about is this idea of rethinking membership. Right now we count members because our dues are based on how many members we have, so that's an important number. But it's also a number that creates anxiety in our congregations. And I'm guilty of saying, how many members do you have, right? Because it's sort of this tangible thing we can hold on to. But I think we're really starting to rethink this. There's this idea floating around about having dues, or APF, which is the money we give to the UU in the district, based on a percentage of budget rather than membership numbers. But it's just a different way of, if we have people that we don't, that are participating but don't sign the book for whatever reason, it's maybe a better way of counting. So anyway, those are sources of hope I have, and I hope to hear what your sources of hope are. And I want to end this particular part of the programming today with a Holly Near song. And I'm going to invite you, I'm just going to sing a part of it to you and have you sing it back to me, but it's Willing is the name of the song. I am open, and I am willing, for to be hopeless, would be so strange. dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. Thank you. We break until 11:15 and then your first workshop will start.